The knife comes down on the burdock root with a sound that is neither a chop nor a slice, but something between the two, a sound that belongs specifically to this vegetable and this motion, and this particular density of a root that has been in the cold ground since autumn. And the kitchen fills with an earthiness so immediate and so specific that it bypasses the thinking part of the brain entirely and lands somewhere older, somewhere that does not use words, somewhere that simply recognizes this smell as the smell of a kitchen that knows what it is doing. The cutting board is worn smooth in the center from years of exactly this motion. The knife is heavy. The burdock does not resist so much as it presents itself to the blade with a kind of dignity. The dignity of a thing that has been growing slowly and seriously for a long time and does not mind being transformed now into something else, into something that will warm a person on a cold evening, into something that will carry its mineral depth into a broth and change the broth entirely and make the person who drinks it feel, without knowing why, that they have been given something they needed. This is the feeling that 25 forgotten Japanese recipes produce when you make them. Not the feeling of having tried something exotic, not the feeling of having successfully executed a technical challenge, not the pride of a complicated thing done correctly, but the quieter, more insistent feeling of having fed yourself in the way you were always supposed to be fed, with ingredients that have been in relationship with the human body for so long that the relationship has become biological, has written itself into the gut and the metabolism and the particular pleasure that the tongue takes in the flavor of a long simmered root or a properly fermented bean or a broth that has been given the hours it requires to become itself. These are not the recipes that appear in the front of the cookbook with the beautiful photographs. They are the recipes from the handwritten index card in the back of the drawer, from the margin note in the copy of the cookbook that belonged to someone's mother, from the memory of a flavor so specific and so complete that you have spent years trying to reconstruct it in kitchens that were not the kitchen where you first tasted it. They are the recipes that the 1970s farmhouse and the Showa apartment and the mountain village and the fishing port all made without calling them recipes, because they were simply what you made, and what you made was what you ate, and what you ate was who you were. The first is Tonjiru, made the way. It was always made before the instant dashi packet simplified everything, and in doing so, subtracted the hour that the simplification saved, and also subtracted everything that hour contained. The pork belly, cut into pieces no thinner than a centimeter, goes into a cold pot with cold water and is brought slowly to the first boil. The gray foam that rises to the surface in the first minutes, skimmed with a flat spoon and discarded. This step called Agedashi, the drawing out of impurities, and it is not optional. It is not a refinement for the precise cook. It is the step that determines whether the finished broth is clean and clear and deep, or slightly muddy and blunt in the way that broth made. Without this attention is always slightly muddy and blunt. The vegetables go in after the skimming. Gobo burdock shaved into thin diagonals and already sitting in cold water to prevent browning. Konjac torn into rough pieces because torn konjac absorbs broth more efficiently than cut konjac. Its irregular surface area greater and more receptive. Daikon cut into half moons, carrot cut into the same. Satoimo taro peeled under running water because the mucilaginous surface of the raw taro makes dry peeling a miserable experience that the running water entirely prevents. The pot simmers for 40 minutes at the lowest heat the burner can produce. The red miso goes in at the end, dissolved through a small strainer held over the pot so that no lumps enter the finished soup. And the heat is turned off the moment the miso has dissolved, because the grandmother's instruction was never boil the miso, and the grandmother's instruction was correct for reasons that have only recently been fully articulated, but were always fully known. The second forgotten recipe is the Hijiki salad that every school lunch program in Japan served in the 1970s and 1980s, and that has since retreated from public consciousness with a completeness that seems like a deliberate erasure, but is actually just the drift of fashion. The way certain things become unfashionable, not because they have become worse, but because the category of cool has moved to a different room and left them in the hallway. And dried Hijiki seaweed, soaked in cold water for 30 minutes until it has expanded to 3 times its dried volume and softened from its hard, brittle state into something tender and slightly resilient, is drained and dried briefly in a hot pan until the excess moisture has evaporated, then joined by julienne carrot and thin strips of abura age that have been poured over with boiling water to remove the surface oil. All of it simmered together in a combination of dashi, soy, mirin, and a small amount of sake until the liquid has been almost entirely absorbed. The hijiki having taken on the color and flavor of the broth, the carrot having softened while retaining just enough resistance to provide textural contrast, and the abura age having swelled with the absorbed liquid until each piece is dense with the flavor of everything else in the pot. It is eaten at room temperature, in small quantities, over rice or beside it, and it improves with a day in the refrigerator, the way all composed things improve with a day in the refrigerator, the flavors having had the time to complete the conversation they began on the stove. The third is the dish that the fishing villages of the Sanriku coast made when the catch was good and the family was together, and the occasion called for something that would take all afternoon and be remembered afterward. Kabuto-ni, the simmered fish head, specifically the large collar and head of yellowtail or sea bream. I use the part of the fish that the filleting process produces as a byproduct and that the fish market sold for almost nothing because the people who bought fish in the modern mode wanted the fillet, the boneless, effortless, pre-processed piece that required no engagement with the animal's actual structure. The kabuto is placed cut side down in a wide, shallow pot and covered with a combination of sake, soy, mirin, and a little sugar, the liquid not quite covering the fish, but reaching halfway up its sides. And a drop lid, the otoshibuda, is placed directly on the surface of the fish and the liquid, and the heat is kept at a moderate simmer for 25 minutes. The pot tilted occasionally so that the braising liquid bastes the exposed surfaces of the fish, the collagen of the collar dissolving into the broth and thickening it, the flesh around the jaw and behind the eye releasing from the bone with a tenderness that requires no knife, only chopsticks used with the patient. Exploratory attention that eating a fish head properly requires, seeking the small pockets of flesh that the casual eater would never find, the cheek meat, the meat along the inner jaw, the tender morsel behind the eye that the Japanese kitchen has always considered the finest part and that the person who has never tried it has been missing without knowing it. The fourth forgotten recipe is the one that the records of every Showa household kitchen reveal as the most frequent weeknight dinner, and that the word recipe barely contains because it was made differently every time from whatever the refrigerator held. The difference being not a variation, but the essential nature of the dish. Kakiage tempura, the mixed fritter of whatever thin-cut vegetables and occasional seafood the day had produced, bound in a loose tempura batter and fried in oil that had been brought to exactly the right temperature. The test being the drop of batter released from the fingertip that sank halfway before rising to the surface being the temperature, the halfway being the density, the rising being the readiness. The tempura batter for kakiage is looser than standard tempura batter, mixed with cold water, always cold water, the ice sometimes floating in the measuring cup, the way the recipe specifies. And the cook who has made this 100 times ignores because cold water from the tap is cold enough, and the ice is a precision that the result does not require. The flour is mixed with the water in no more than 10 strokes. The lumps left in, the gluten deliberately underdeveloped because developed gluten produces a heavy, bread-like coating, and undeveloped gluten produces the light shattering, paper-thin shell that tempura batter is supposed to produce. The vegetables are mixed through the batter until just coated and dropped in spoonfuls into the oil and left alone, not touched or moved for the first minute, the batter needing that minute to set around the vegetables before any movement is applied, after which the kakiage is turned once and fried for another 2 minutes and removed to the draining rack and eaten immediately because tempura is only itself for approximately 4 minutes after it leaves the oil. And after that, it is a memory of itself, which is a different and lesser thing. The fifth is the dish that demonstrates most completely the Japanese kitchen's genius for making a small amount of protein feed a large table. Sukiyaki no tare, the sweet savory sauce made from soy and mirin and sake and sugar in proportions that each family maintained with a specificity that bordered on secrecy, used to cook thin sliced beef with tofu and noodles and vegetables at the table in a cast iron pan, the raw egg beaten in a small bowl beside each place, setting into which each piece of cooked food was dipped before eating. The egg coating the hot food with a thin, rich, slightly cooked film that lowered the effective saltiness of the sauce and added a creaminess that made each piece of thin beef taste like more beef than it was. This is the trick of sukiyaki that no recipe mentions as a trick, because in the context of its origin, it was not a trick but a necessity. 100 grams of thinly sliced beef, dipped in egg, distributed among 4 people with tofu and shirataki noodles, and napa cabbage and spring onion, feeds 4 people a meal that feels complete and satisfying, and even, in the memory that follows it, generous. The egg is the extender. The table cooking is the entertainment. The cast iron pan that has been seasoned by 40 years of use is the vessel through which everything that came before this meal has contributed to the flavor of this one. The 6th forgotten recipe is the one that demonstrates the Japanese kitchen's relationship with cold as a cooking technique. Shim-dofu, the tofu that has been frozen and then thawed, a transformation that converts the smooth, dense, white block of regular tofu into something porous and sponge-like and deeply different in its texture and its capacity to absorb flavor. The ice crystals formed during freezing, expanding, and rupturing the protein matrix of the tofu in a way that leaves, when the ice melts, a network of open channels through which broth flows freely and completely. Shimi-dofu simmered in a dashi of kombu, and shiitake and soy and mirin absorbs the broth until each piece is saturated, dense with flavor throughout rather than only at its surface. And each bite delivers the complete taste of the broth rather than the taste of tofu with broth adjacent to it. The recipe is freeze the tofu, thaw it, press out the remaining water, simmer it slowly in good dashi with patience and without hurrying. It requires no skill except the skill of doing exactly what the recipe says, which is the skill that most recipes actually require and that the modern kitchen, overfull with technique and instruction, sometimes forgets to name as the primary skill. The 7th is the Agedashi tofu that the izakaya serves now with the precision of a dish that has been refined and standardized, and that the home version surpasses not through superior technique, but through the specific liberty of the home kitchen, which can adjust the sweetness of the tentsuyu to the preference of the person eating it. Akdi can serve it the moment it comes from the oil, rather than the moment it arrives at a table that is 3 minutes of walking from the kitchen. Can eat it while standing at the counter if that is what the evening calls for. The tentsuyu drunk from the bowl afterward. Because the broth that has absorbed the flavor of the fried tofu and the grated daikon and the grated ginger is not a garnish, but a continuation of the meal. The silken tofu is cut into blocks and dried on a cloth for 20 minutes before frying. The surface moisture being the enemy of good Agedashi, producing steam in the oil that prevents the coating from adhering and the crust from forming. The 20 minutes of drying being the patience that the recipe requires and that the impatient cook skips and then wonders at the inferior result. The dried blocks are dusted in potato starch and lowered gently into oil at 180 degrees. Fried until the coating is barely golden, 3 minutes, removed and placed in the tentsuyu immediately so that the hot tofu continues to absorb the broth while the coating softens at its inner surface and crisps at its outer surface simultaneously, creating a texture that exists in no other preparation, a texture that is only itself and only briefly. The 8th forgotten recipe is one that the 1970s kitchen made on the mornings after a dinner party, when the leftover rice was cold in the rice cooker and the refrigerator held the ends and remnants of the previous evening's cooking, the last of the braised vegetable, the single remaining piece of fish, the broth that was too good to discard but too little for another soup, Zosui, the rice porridge made from cooked rice rather than raw, the rice already soft and needing only to be broken down further in the reheated broth, stirring it gently until each grain has begun to dissolve at its edges and contributed its starch to the liquid, thickening it until the whole pot has become something between a soup and a porridge, something that holds the flavor of everything that went into it and that tastes. Because of this, more complex and more considered than its actual preparation time justifies. An egg beaten and stirred in at the end. A few drops of soy, the last of the metsuba leaves from the bunch in the vegetable drawer. 5 minutes from refrigerator to bowl, and the result is the meal that the morning requires, Anjid, which is the meal that uses what remains and wastes nothing and asks for very little, and returns a warmth that no effort commensurate calculation would have predicted. The ninth is the recipe that requires 2 days, but only 20 minutes of actual work. Shio-koji marinated chicken, the chicken thighs rubbed with shio-koji, the mixture of koji rice and salt that was a fixture of the Showa farmhouse pantry, and that has recently experienced a revival in the professional kitchen world with the kind of enthusiasm that greets rediscovery, as though the thing had been lost when it had only been quiet, waiting in the back of the pantry for someone to open the jar again. The shio-koji does to chicken what time and patience do to most things. It improves it. The enzymes of the koji, the same Aspergillus oryzae cultures that ferment miso and soy sauce, break down the surface proteins of the chicken into shorter amino acid chains and the muscle fibers into more tender configurations, and they convert the glycogen in the meat into simple sugars that caramelize under heat into a deeper, more complex browning than untreated chicken achieves. The chicken marinated in shio-koji for 48 hours and then grilled or baked produces a result that restaurant kitchens try to approximate with brines and compound butters and injection techniques, a result that the home kitchen produces by putting the chicken in a bag with the shio-koji and putting the bag in the refrigerator for 2 days, and then cooking the chicken. The technique being almost embarrassingly simple relative to the result. The gap between effort and outcome being, in this recipe, a kind of grace. The 10th is the scattered sushi, Chirashi-zushi, made not as the elaborate preparation of the sushi restaurant with its raw fish and its precision cuts, but as the home preparation of the festival and the special occasion. The sushi rice spread in the large wooden ohitsu bowl and covered with whatever the season and the budget had produced. Thin omelet, cut into fine strips, simmered shiitake mushrooms, cooked lotus root in sweet vinegar, green peas, pickled ginger, a few pieces of sweet simmered tofu skin, if the cook had made it, smoked salmon if the family had adopted that accommodation to the modern age, or the salted salmon that the traditional version specified. The sushi rice itself is the recipe within the recipe. The rice cooked slightly drier than normal, the seasoning of rice vinegar and sugar and salt, mixed in a separate pan and warmed until the sugar dissolves, and poured over the hot rice in the ohitsu and folded in with a flat paddle, while a second person fans the rice to cool it quickly. The fanning step producing the sheen on the finished rice that signals that the seasoning has been absorbed and the cooling has been rapid enough, and the rice is ready to receive everything that will be placed on top of it. If you do not have a second person to fan the rice, you fan it yourself with whatever is available, a magazine, a flat lid, the side of a cutting board, and the rice is less lustrous but still correct, still itself, still the foundation on which everything else is arranged. The 11th forgotten recipe is the one that the summer kitchen made from the cucumber that was coming ripe faster than anyone could eat it raw. Kyuri no tsukemono, the simplest of all pickles. The cucumber cut into rough pieces and placed in a bag with salt and a weight on top and left for 2 hours, the salt drawing the water out of the cucumber and creating the brine in which the cucumber then re-marinates, absorbing its own expelled liquid now transformed by the salt into something that flavors the cucumber from the inside with a depth that no externally applied dressing achieves. After 2 hours, the cucumber pieces are wrung out gently and dressed with a few drops of soy and a few drops of sesame oil and a small amount of grated ginger and eaten immediately, cold. The crunch of the partially wilted cucumber being different from the crunch of the raw cucumber in a way that is difficult to describe but immediately recognizable, a crunch with more give in it, a crunch that yields rather than simply breaking, a crunch that has been improved by the patience of 2 hours. The 12th is the recipe that exists at the intersection of frugality and sophistication, and that the Japanese kitchen has occupied so naturally for so long that the intersection itself has become a characteristic of the tradition. Niku-dofu, simmered tofu, and meat, the beef or pork that flavors without dominating. On the tofu that receives the flavor of the meat and the broth and the soy and the mirin, and becomes something richer and more complex than tofu alone, while the meat becomes something tenderer and more deeply flavored than it would be if it were the primary subject of the preparation. They improve each other. They are better together than either is alone, which is also a description of the Japanese meal structure in general, the principle of the small dish and the shared pot, and the table around which people bring what they have, and combine it with what others have brought, and eat from a common pot, the result of that combination. The 13th forgotten recipe is the one that requires the most trust. Hakuri because it requires trusting a process that produces nothing visible for the first 12 hours and produces everything in the subsequent 30 minutes. The dashi that is made by cold brewing kombu overnight and then adding katsuobushi in the morning. The kombu removed just before boiling. The katsuobushi added to the hot kombu water and allowed to steep for 3 minutes without boiling. The liquid poured through a cloth-lined strainer and the resulting dashi, clear and golden and smelling of the ocean, in the particular way that the combination of kombu glutamate and bonito inosinate produces, used as the base of everything that follows that day. The miso soup, the simmered vegetable, the noodle broth, the simmered egg, the dashi made this way, the ichiban dashi, the first dashi, is to the dashi made from a packet what the handwritten letter is to the text message. Both communicate. Only one of them changes the quality of everything built on its foundation. The 14th is the recipe of the cold months, the Oden that begins on the stove in the early afternoon and arrives at the table in the early evening and sits on the lowest heat through the evening for anyone who wants more. The broth growing richer, and the daikon growing more translucent, and the konnyaku growing more deeply flavored as the hours pass, and the ingredients continue their long conversation with each other and with the dashi that surrounds them. The Oden broth is the recipe within the recipe. The long simmered combination of kombu dashi and a careful measure of light soy sauce and mirin and a little sake, the proportions subtle enough that the broth reads as savory without reading as soy, as sweet without reading as mirin, as complex without revealing the mechanism of that complexity. The daikon goes in first, cut into thick rounds and scored on the cut surface to allow the broth to penetrate, simmered for 20 minutes in plain water before joining the Oden broth so that the harshness of the raw daikon does not affect the clarity of the dashi. The eggs go in early, hard-boiled and peeled, turning amber over the hours as they absorb the broth. The konnyaku is torn, not cut. The fish cakes go in last because they need only warmth, not simmering. The 15th is the rice dish that every Japanese grandmother made on birthdays and celebrations, not because it was elaborate, but because the red of the azuki beans that colored the rice was the color of good fortune and the color of the occasion, and the combination of the fragrant, sweet, savory, seasoned, glutinous rice and the soft beans was the flavor of something being marked, being honored, being given its proper weight. Sekihan, red rice, made from glutinous rice, soaked overnight with the dried azuki beans and their soaking water, steamed together until the rice has absorbed the deep burgundy of the bean liquid, and each grain has taken on the color of the occasion it is made for. The 16th through 18th come in the voice of the sea, because the Japanese kitchen is never far from the sea, even when it is geographically far from the sea, the dried and preserved products of the coast having traveled inland for centuries along the routes that salt and commerce opened, and the flavors of the sea having become as native to the mountain kitchen as the flavors of the mountain are native to the fishing port. Wakame to tofu no miso shiru, made with fresh wakame when the season allows and dried when it does not. The wakame cut into small pieces and added to the miso soup at the very last moment after the heat has been turned off, so that it retains its bright green color and its delicate texture, rather than cooking down to the dull, soft tangle that overcooked seaweed becomes. Ika no shio-yaki, the squid rubbed with salt and grilled directly over the gas flame on a wire rack. The salt drawing the surface moisture out and allowing the skin to char slightly in the way that gives grilled squid its particular flavor. The body sliced into rings after cooking and the tentacles left whole, eaten with a squeeze of sudachi or lemon, and a small glass of cold barley tea, and hotai to no barashoyu, the scallops seared in a small amount of butter in the iron pan, until the first side has developed a crust, the color of caramel, turned once, a pour of soy added at the last moment so that it hits the hot pan and spatters and caramelizes immediately and coats the scallop, in a dark, sweet, savory glaze that is the Japanese kitchen's precise and unrepeatable answer to the question of what butter and soy and heat in a scallop become when they meet at the right temperature. Ashi, the 19th forgotten recipe, is the one that the home cook makes when the cooking has become too complicated and the return to simplicity is needed. Tamago to negi no miso shiru, egg and spring onion miso soup. The egg beaten and stirred into the barely simmering dashi in a thin stream so that it cooks in soft, pale ribbons through the broth. The miso dissolved in at the end. The spring onion added in thin rings at the very last moment so that it retains its sharpness and its color and provides the bright, clean note that the richness of the egg and the depth of the miso require to stay in balance. The 20th is the dish that the children of the 1970s remember, with the particular intensity reserved for food that was also occasion. Curry udon, the thick wheat noodles in a broth that was not the curry of the curry rice but a lighter, i.e. thinner version. The curry powder bloomed in a little oil before the dashi was added. The broth thickened with a small amount of potato starch dissolved in cold water, poured over the udon in a deep bowl with a piece of kamaboko fish cake and a handful of green onion, and eaten with a large spoon because the broth was too good to leave in the bowl, and chopsticks alone were insufficient to the task of consuming it. The 21st is the recipe that produces the most transformative result from the least glamorous ingredient. Daikon no kakuni, slow simmered daikon in a broth of soy and mirin and sake and a little sugar. The daikon cut into thick cylinders and simmered for an hour and a half until they have become translucent throughout and taken on the color of the broth and a texture that offers no resistance to the chopstick, simply yielding completely, the exterior and interior having become the same thing, which is the definition of a properly simmered vegetable and the aspiration of all Nemono cooking. The 22nd through 24th follow the logic of the end of the week, when the pantry has given most of what it had and the cooking must work harder with less. Shikuzen-ni, the simmered chicken and root vegetables of Kyushu, the chicken browned first in sesame oil, and the vegetables added and simmered in dashi and soy and mirin until the sauce has reduced to a glaze. And every ingredient in the pot has contributed to and absorbed from every other ingredient in the pot. The whole greater than its parts in the way that long-simmered dishes are always greater than their parts. Kenatama, after the crab and egg dish that is the Japanese kitchen's version of the egg foo-young, the egg beaten with crab meat and green onion and ginger and sesame oil, and cooked in a hot pan in a pool of oil until the edge is set, and the center remains soft, and the whole thing is slid onto rice and covered with a thin ankake sauce of dashi and soy, thickened with potato starch. And finally, the simple, perfect, endlessly reliable grilled onigiri. The cold rice balls pressed firm and grilled in the pan until both flat sides have developed a golden crust, brushed with soy in the last minute of cooking so that the soy caramelizes against the hot rice, and the kitchen smells of the thing that the kitchen has always smelled of when something correct is being made. The 25th forgotten recipe is not a single dish, but the practice that makes all 24 preceding dishes possible, and that the modern kitchen has most thoroughly forgotten. The preparation of the mise en place of the Japanese kitchen, the daily maintenance of the pantry that ensures the cook is never more than 30 minutes from a complete and nourishing meal. The miso in the crock, the dried kombu in the jar, the shiitake on the drying rack or in the bag, the rice in the ceramic container, the soy in the bottle that is replenished before it empties, the mirin and the sake and the salt and the sesame and the dried fish and the pickles in the back of the refrigerator, the burdock in the cold water, the tofu pressed in its cloth. This is not shopping. It is not meal prep in the modern sense of portioned containers and calculated macros and the industrialization of the domestic kitchen. It is the maintenance of a readiness, the daily attention to the state of the pantry that allows the cook to look into it at 6 in the evening and see not a collection of ingredients, but a collection of possibilities, each one capable of becoming something complete and nourishing and warm, each one waiting for the hand that knows what to do with it. The knife that comes down on the burdock root with the sound that belongs specifically to this vegetable and this motion and this kitchen. The cutting board worn smooth in the center, the knife heavy in the hand, the burdock dignified and ready, the smell of the kitchen that knows what it is doing. I'm filling every room in the house before you have even begun.